Welcome, everybody. Welcome back to the fourth and final lecture in Michael Walzer's Stimson lectures on the general subject of whatever happened to national liberation. We heard two lectures last week on the paradox of national liberation. The first outlined this paradox by reference to the discussion of Israel, India, and Algeria, and the paradox that concerned Michael centrally was between the secular nationalism of national liberation movements and the fundamentalist backlash that they subsequently generated. In the second of those lectures, he explored that subject in much greater depth in the context of Israel and Palestine, and particularly the tension between Zionism and Judaism, and its implications not only for the character of the Israeli state that has developed, but also its implications for the evolution of Palestinian nationalism and Palestinian politics subsequently. Then yesterday, in true to form, Michael anticipated critiques of his argument from Marxist and post-colonial critics, and in particular, he took on Perry Anderson's discussion is an implicit critique of Michael's view, his discussion of Israel, India, and Ireland, and developed an anticipatory response to that, to Perry Anderson's argument, which I couldn't possibly summarize with the eloquence that Michael deployed, but I would, to reduce it to my own formulation, was essentially a version of the argument that Anderson's critique of national liberation movements throws the baby out with the bathwater, and that a more nuanced and subtler discussion is needed in order to take account of the sort of impulses that those who make these arguments appeal to. In today's final lecture, Michael is going to talk about the future of national liberation. It's a disappointment to me only in one sense, and that is that it's the final lecture. I don't know what I'm going to do next Wednesday and Thursday afternoon. These have really been stunningly interesting lectures, and we're all going to be looking forward to the book that will be forthcoming from Yale University Press sooner rather than later, I hope and think. But so, Michael, welcome for the fourth and final lecture in your series.
So I want to thank those of you who have stuck with me through four meetings, and today I will try to offer some answers to the questions that I've been posing about what happened and what might happen, what happened to national liberation, and what to do about it. Last time I insisted on the difference between secular national liberation and religious revivalism against critics who said that they were actually not so different. And today I want to try to face again the paradox of liberation and ask why the liberationists have not been able to consolidate their achievement and reproduce themselves in successive generations. Indian intellectuals and academics have, over the past 20 years, been debating this question in its local version. Why is it, one of them asks, that the Nehruvian vision of a secular India failed to take hold? The current argument was begun, or I first came upon it, in the writing of Ashish Nandi, a longtime critic of both secular nationalism and Hindutva. He's the person who called them the disowned doubles of each other. And in an article entitled "The Politics of Secularism and the Recovery of Religious Toleration," Nandi evokes a pre-modern, pluralist, and tolerant Hinduism, fuzzy and syncretistic, which the militants of national liberation, he says, ignored and suppressed. Their secularist and modernist radicalism produced a pathological reaction which is revivalist and also modernist. The modernism is shared. Having learned from Western theories of statecraft, the partisans of liberation and the partisans of religious revival are equally willing to use the power of the modern state against their opponents. So, Nandy's critique of Hindu nationalism, writes the philosopher Akhil Bilgrami, is intended to be of a piece with the critique of Nehruvian secularism. Hindutva, itself the product of modernity, owes its very existence to the oppositional but at the same time internal dialectical relation it bears to secularism. This isn't a Marxist internationalist critique, but rather an anti-modernist critique, and it has attracted wide support in India from writers, some of whom might best be identified as latter-day Gandhians, while others are postmodernists and post-colonialists. Nandy argues that Gandhi's use of Hindu motifs was justified because his Hinduism was authentic, that is, located in traditions outside the ideological grid of modernity. By contrast, Hindutva is radically inauthentic. Nandy writes mockingly about the RSS, a paramilitary Hindu nationalist group. Whatever the revivalist Hindu may seek to revive, it is not Hinduism. The pathetically comic martial uniform of khaki shorts, which the RSS cadres have to wear, tells it all. Modeled on the uniform of the colonial police, the khaki shorts identify the RSS as the illegitimate child of Western colonialism. Nandy has similar things to say about the Nehruvian state, which took upon itself, he writes, the same civilizing mission that the colonial states had once taken upon themselves vis-a-vis the ancient faiths of the subcontinent. That last point is certainly true. It's another example of the paradox of national liberation, but not one that necessarily carries the condemnation that Nandy intends. In 1829, for example, the British banned the sati, the ritual immolation of a Hindu widow on her husband's funeral pyre. And after independence, the new Indian government reiterated the ban, acting out, I suppose, the same civilizing mission. By contrast, some leading figures of the Hindu revival have spoken up in defense of sati, and in this case, they don't appear to be inauthentic. Indeed, the difficulty with Nandy's position, as his Indian critics have pointed out, is that however pluralist and tolerant Hinduism may have been, it was also hierarchical and oppressive, especially oppressive to women. The rise of Hindutva is as much a response to the egalitarianism of the liberationists as to their secularism. The hegemony of the Brahmins, the comforts of caste, and the traditional constraints on the life of women, all these are closer to the heart of the revival and probably closer to the heart of the pre-modern religion, too, than is religious pluralism. For Democrats and liberals, then, the ancient faith isn't and shouldn't be on the political agenda. Nor should we be too quick to condemn the impact of Western modernity and of Western liberalism on Indian society. The civilizing mission may have been hypocritical, an ideology of imperialism, but it was also sometimes a useful prod to local activists. It's worth remembering what R.C. Dutt, one of the first presidents of the Indian National Congress, wrote in the early years of nationalist agitation. The right of the peasants to be educated, to be freed from the trammels of ignorance, to be saved from the oppression of landlords, such ideas have invariably emanated from our rulers and not from us. As I have been arguing in these lectures, national liberation is the work of men and women who learned a great deal from their imperial rulers and used what they learned in the interests of liberation, struggling at the same time against imperialism and also against some of their own people's most revered customs and practices. The liberationists retained the structures of the imperial state because they believed, in the words of Dipesh Chakrabarty, one of the leading post-colonial writers, they believed in an Enlightenment rationalism that requires as its vehicle the modern state and its accompanying institutions, the instruments of governability, in Foucault's terms. But I'm not sure that is the critique that Chakrabarty intends, for it's hard to imagine any other instruments of governability that could end untouchable, the persecution, the exclusion of untouchables, or lift the constraints on the lives of women, or protect religious minorities. But this statist commitment and this opposition to their people's customs, writes Aditya Nigam, a colleague of Nandi's at the Center for the Study of Developing Societies in New Delhi, this commitment and this opposition were too abstract. It's as if the goal of the liberationists was not a new Indian man, as they claimed, but a universal citizen. There is no concrete cultural content to the liberationist project, Nigam argues, and so the project turned out to be a front for the continued domination of Brahmin elites, and its defenders were unable to offer significant resistance to the ideologists of Hindutva. This argument is an Indian version of Aaron Megged's explanation for the failures of Zionist secularism and the rise of religious zealotry. Every vacuum must fill up. It isn't a fair argument in the Indian or the Israeli case. In the early years of independence, the Congress-dominated government undertook a massive educational effort on behalf of the new Constitution. Nehru and his friends certainly expounded and defended the liberal values they were trying to realize. So Nandi may be right to claim that the problem with Nehruvian secularism wasn't that it was too abstract, but that it was too absolute in its challenge to Hindu and Muslim traditionalism. It is absolutism that best accounts for the strength and militancy of the religious reaction. A number of Nandi's critics have made a similar claim, and I want to look a little longer at their suggestions for dealing with Hindutva and its defenders. And I will then ask whether the religious revival in Israel can be addressed in a similar way. The central problem with Nehru's politics, according to Bill Gramy, was that his secularism was Archimedean rather than negotiated. By this, Bill Gramy means that secularism stood outside the substantive arena of political commitment. Remember Archimedes' boast that he could move the universe if only he could stand somewhere outside it. For the national liberationists, secularism was an external standpoint of this sort from which Indian society could be moved, could be transformed. The secularist project didn't emerge from society itself. It wasn't the product of internal arguments and negotiations. As Nigam writes, Hindu and Muslim orthodoxy was never defeated in open battle in society at large. And the reason that secularism wasn't negotiated or openly fought for is that Nehru and his associates were unwilling, Bill Gramy claims, to acknowledge the existence of religious communities and communitarian commitments. But why the unwillingness? Here there is a deep tension in the liberationist position, a tension common, I think, to all the other national liberation movements. On the one hand, Nehru did not believe that the religious communities had a future. Religious belief, or at least its more fervent and superstitious versions, would vanish at the touch of reality. After independence, Nehru wrote in The Discovery of India, there would be class conflicts, but no religious conflicts, except insofar as religion itself expressed some vested interest. He meant some economic interest. One has to wonder what India he had discovered. But in fact, this faith in the decline of faith was, as I argued in the first of these lectures, widely shared. On the other hand, Nehru knew very well the strength of both Hinduism and Islam, and he certainly understood the near identity of the caste and economic hierarchies. So his refusal to recognize the religious communities wasn't determined so much by blindness as by fear. To recognize them, he said, would be to encourage and entrench them. I suppose that these two views can be held simultaneously. Religious identity is a clear and present danger, while secularization, however inevitable, lies somewhere in the future. Still, these are different views, and in the Indian case, the difference was acted out in a very special way. On the assumption that the erosion of belief was at least begun and could be speeded up, and that vested interests had to be confronted, the new Indian state set out to reform Hindu laws and practices. The Constitution, written immediately after independence, abolished untouchability and banned discrimination on the basis of religion or caste. Over the next decade, Parliament established a single code of personal law for all Hindu citizens. They acted with a slowness and reluctance that infuriated Ambedkar, the untouchable activist who was Nehru's first Minister of Justice, but they acted. The new code permitted intercaste marriage, legalized divorce, prohibited polygamy, gave daughters the same inheritance rights as sons, and much more. The aim of the liberationists, Partha Chatterjee writes, was to initiate a process of rational interpretation of religious doctrine. In fact, what they were doing was denying the name religious to much of what was traditionally understood as religious doctrine. According to the new Constitution, every community had the right to manage its own affairs in matters of religion. But state officials insisted on a narrow definition of religion, or at least a narrow definition of Hinduism. I do not understand, Ambedkar wrote, why religion should be given a vast, expansive jurisdiction so as to cover the whole of life. The proper coverage was limited to belief and worship. Everything beyond that fell within the jurisdiction of the state. After all, Ambedkar continues, what is this liberty for? The point of independence was to reform our social system, which is full of inequalities and discrimination. All this was said with regard to Hinduism. For what were probably good reasons, however, there was no similar effort to restrict the reach of Islam and establish a recognized, rationalized system of personal law for the Muslim minority. Nehru and his associates were not ready to challenge the strength of Islamic belief and the authority of Sharia. For the majority, there would be liberation. For the minority, there would be religious liberty, with Islam allowed precisely the vast, expansive jurisdiction that Ambedkar was so eager to deny to Hinduism. In effect, there was no negotiation with either religious community. State officials decided, top down, to reform Hindu law and to tolerate Muslim law. From the liberationist standpoint, this was greatly to the advantage of the Hindus. The socialist leader J.B. Kripalani argued that if the members of parliament single out the Hindu community for their reforming zeal, they cannot escape the charge of being communalists, in the sense that they favor the Hindus and are indifferent to the good of the Muslims. Hindu traditionalists made exactly the opposite charge, claiming that it was the Muslims who were being favored. In any event, top-down reform was only partially successful, so the favoritism was limited. When India won its independence, writes Harold Isaacs, all untouchables became ex-untouchables by law, but they remained untouchables in fact. That isn't quite right. An extensive program of affirmative action opened new opportunities to younger members of what had come to be called, at the insistence of untouchable militants, the Dalit community, the oppressed community. Hindutva, as I've already said, is in part a reaction to the special treatment, reserved offices, and welfare benefits accorded to both the untouchables and the lowest castes, a practice that has the simultaneous effect of maintaining caste lines. Postmodernist writers say that it essentializes caste while threatening the traditional caste hierarchy. These are the ambiguities of liberation. They are perhaps especially clear in the case of Hindu and Muslim women, the former the beneficiaries of the new civil code, the latter still ruled by Islamic personal law. In a famous court case, Shah Bano, in 1985, the judges sought to extend the protection of the civil code to a divorced Muslim wife, but Parliament undid the decision with the new Muslim Women Act in 1986. Who is being favored here? From the standpoint of Hindu nationalists, the new legislation was yet another example of the Indian state and the Congress Party bending over backward to favor the Muslim minority, which was again allowed to maintain its traditional practices. By contrast, the All India Democratic Women's Association and other feminist groups, which are the true heirs of national liberation, insisted rightly that the new law was no favor to Muslim women. In March of 1986, 35 women's organizations, including Muslim groups, joined together to demonstrate for a uniform secular code, which was the original promise of Nehru and his associates. I can't pursue these issues any further. My knowledge of Indian history and politics doesn't reach to their complexities. I only want to insist that through all the compromises and confusions of political practice since 1947, it is still possible to mark clearly the difference between secular liberation and both traditional and revivalist religion. I suspect that the differences are most clear with regard to the subordination of women. It is the demand for gender equality that poses the greatest challenge to traditional religion and is, I suspect, the most important cause, or certainly one of the centrally important causes, of revivalist zealotry in all three of my cases. Certainly the members of the All India Democratic Women's Association, whose name suggests a national project, All India, are in no sense the twins or the secret doubles of the Hindutva militants. Nor does Nehru's decision in the 40s to allow religious liberty to the Muslim minority in the field of family law make him a twin of Muslim traditionalists, despite the happiness of the mullahs with the legal recognition of Sharia. Both these pairs, democratic women and Hindutva militants, Nehruvian liberals and Muslim traditionalists, are in fact long-term political opponents. But by what means should this opposition be pursued? What do Indian critics of Nehru's Archimedean politics mean when they call for a negotiated secularism? In October 2004, the socialist magazine Janata reported on a conference in New Delhi on the condition of Muslim women. The conferees included feminist activists and male members of the Muslim Personal Law Board. Naturally, the two groups disagreed. But what was most interesting was that, and I'm now quoting the magazine, numerous women participants argued from within an Islamic paradigm, quoting verse after verse from the Quran and citing traditions attributed to the Prophet to make their case for gender justice. These women were a new force says the Janata reporter, they had the moral authority that feminists who are seen as alienated from their societies and traditions lack. The same claim can be made, I think, for the members of a group called Women Living Under Muslim Laws, WLUML. It doesn't make a nice acronym. A feminist organization founded in the 1980s by women from a number of Muslim-majority countries, including, importantly, Algeria, whose work has reached to India, where the Muslims are a very large minority. The members of WLUML are both religious and secular, and one of their central goals is to provide reinterpretations of Muslim laws relating to the status of women. The plural form, laws, is important to this project. They insist that there are different understandings and different enactments of what is always described as Quranic law. So women now can join an argument that doesn't have what the religious zealots insist on, a single authoritative conclusion delivered by learned men. By joining the argument rather than standing outside it, they hope to win at least a hearing from religious Muslims, men and women alike. If they are learned, as many of them are, they can also be authoritative. Amartya Sen lays claim to the same kind of moral authority for Democrats and pluralists when he argues that ideas of public debate and respect for religious difference have roots in ancient Indian thought, and provides many examples. His argument is different from Nandi's, though some of his examples might serve them both. Sen claims that important modernist ideas are not modernist inventions. They were expressed long ago, though in different idioms. They are part of a common heritage that may have to be selectively rejected, but that can also be selectively reclaimed. It may well be the case that the best arguments for gender justice and for democratic pluralism are secular and philosophical in character. But philosophy doesn't rule the day here. The best moral and political arguments are ones that derive from the inherited culture of the people who need to be convinced. Engagement with that culture is what Nehru's critics mean by negotiation. They argue that secularism in the West derives from a political negotiation with Protestant Christianity, and so they imagine internal arguments that might produce Hindu and Muslim versions of secular doctrine, and also of democratic, egalitarian, and feminist doctrines. Uma Narayan, an Indian woman working in the United States, has worked out a theoretical version of these arguments in her book, Dislocating Cultures, Identities, Traditions, and Third World Feminism. She takes on the charge that demands for gender equality represent a capitulation to the cultural domination of a colonizing West. Now, as Marx's articles, his famous articles on India show, this charge can also be a boast. All good modern ideas come from the historically advanced countries of the West. And it is certainly true, as I have shown in these lectures, that many leaders of the national liberation movements were Westernizers. But Narayan argues for two important caveats here, with special reference to what was once called the woman question. First, when the liberation movements began in late 19th century India, for example, gender equality was hardly a dominant ideology in the West. And second, Indian feminists can plausibly argue that their struggle for equality, and I'm quoting Narayan now, is no less rooted in our experiences within our cultures, no less representative of our complex and changing reality than the views of Indians hostile to feminism. Liberation, as I suggested last time, yesterday, liberation is a reiterative process. It doesn't happen once for everybody in the world. It happens again and again. But that doesn't mean that each successive struggle is nothing more than an imitation of the struggle that went before. Yes, many Indian feminists did learn their feminism in the West. Remember the Oxford education of Rajkumari Amrit Kaur. But they also made it their own in the course of their engagement with their Indian sisters. Narayan's book goes well beyond claiming that feminism has Indian roots. She argues for the cultivation of those roots. She makes a very strong case for a connected and, so to speak, naturalized feminism. That is, a feminism that is embedded in national narratives and religious traditions. Let me quote one summary statement of her position, which comes very close to the position I have meant to defend in these lectures. It would be dangerous, she writes, for feminists to attempt to challenge prevailing views of religion and religious tradition purely by resort to secularism. Many religious traditions are in fact more capacious than fundamentalist adherents allow. Insisting on humane and inclusive interpretations of these traditions might in many contexts be crucial in countering the deployment of religious discourse for problematic nationalist ends. This isn't an argument about stooping to conquer. Narayan writes movingly about the importance of national and religious commitments in the life of ordinary men and women, shaping their sense of who they are and their understanding of the social world. She's arguing for an honest and compassionate engagement with these men and women. There are, of course, pragmatic political reasons for such an engagement. Refusing it will, as she says, marginalize progressive and feminist voices whose political interventions in the discourse of nationalism are increasingly crucial. But there are also democratic reasons for this engagement. Narayan quotes Virginia Woolf's anti-nationalist lines from 1938. As a woman, I have no country. As a woman, I want no country. As a woman, my country is the whole world. Virginia Woolf must have read, as I never suspected her of doing, Marx on the working class. Narayan argues, on the contrary, that women do have a country, and they share a fate with their fellow citizens who need to hear their voice. Traditionalist worldviews can't be negated, abolished, or banned. They have to be engaged. I've made this argument several times in these lectures. It may not be an argument useful to or even accessible to the liberation militants at the height of their struggle against the old religion and the culture of passivity and subservience. Only a few intellectuals aimed at engagement in those years, and they didn't get much support. Nehru may have regarded his discovery of India as an example of engagement, and what he discovered in Indian history is impressive, an ancient, complex, and multicultural composite civilization. He even claimed to have found that, quote, bad as the legal position of women was in ancient India, judged by modern standards, it was far better than in ancient Greece and Rome, in early Christianity, in the canon law of medieval Europe, and indeed right up to comparatively modern times. But with regard to the religious traditions that played such a large part in shaping Indian civilization and in determining the customary roles of women, Nehru was mostly tone-deaf. His discovery, or maybe it's an invention, of a civilization wonderfully attractive to secular intellectuals bears some resemblance to the Zionist discovery or invention of biblical Israel. Neither one came to grips with the actual religious beliefs and practices of the people who had to be liberated. Maybe that wasn't possible. Maybe it was necessary first to lay down the secular law, as Nehru and Ambedkar did in the new Indian Constitution and Civil Code, and only when these turn out to be incompletely effective, and when they provoke a religious reaction, do the engagements and negotiations have to begin. So this is the question that secular liberals and Democrats must face. How can national liberation make itself central to the ongoing life of the nation? How can it regain and sustain its political hegemony? And this is the deepest question that I mean to raise in these lectures, and which the Indian writers I've just been quoting have begun to address. What has gone wrong with, and what are the obstacles to, the cultural reproduction of, let's call it, the secular left? Liberation cannot succeed. Hegemony cannot be sustained by negation alone. That's the beginning of an answer to these questions. The fact of hegemony, writes Antonio Gramsci, its foremost theorist, presupposes that one takes into account the interests and tendencies of the groups over which hegemony will be exercised. And it also presupposes a certain equilibrium. That is to say, that the hegemonic groups will make some sacrifices. Fierce and unrelenting hostility may be crucial to the liberation movement's initial mobilization, and it necessarily figures also in secular responses to the traditionalist counter-revolution. But it isn't a creative force. It doesn't take the interests of traditional Hindus, Muslims, and Jews into account, and it doesn't move toward the required equilibrium. So consider now the Zionist case. I'm going to conclude here, since this is the case with which I am myself most engaged. In Israel, it seems clear that the negation of exilic Judaism has failed, and that the leap to the biblical past and other efforts to find usable bits and pieces of the tradition serve only to produce a Jewish kitsch which cannot compete with a revived Judaism. The claim to a radical newness gives rise inexorably to a radicalized oldness. With Judaism, as with Hinduism and Islam, it is possible that the oldness was in fact more pluralistic, more accepting of difference in practice, if not in doctrine, than either the secular liberationists imagine or the religious zealots admit. Maybe. But I don't think that nostalgia is any more attractive in Israel than in India. There is indeed much that needed to be and still needs to be negated. The fearfulness and passivity of traditional Judaism, the dominance of the rabbis, the subordination of women. But alongside the ongoing work of negation, the tradition has to be acknowledged and its different parts ingathered, as the poet Bialik argued, collected, translated, incorporated into the culture of the new. Only then can traditional Judaism be pulled apart, if that's what people want to do. Its most important features, laws and maxims, ceremonies and practices, historical and fictional narratives, critically appraised. And only then can those features be accepted or rejected or revised. Only then can they become the subject of an ongoing argument and negotiation. It is argument itself, with its varying outcomes, that constitutes the Gramscian equilibrium, not any single or final balance of acceptance and rejection. One can be a very radical critic of the religious tradition, as I would be, while still taking account of its value for the Jewish people or for the Indian or the Algerian people. But the commitment to take account means that one must learn something about the world of one's traditionalist opponents. The opposite of negation is not acceptance, but again, intellectual and political engagement. Since Zionism is a political movement, the most obvious area of engagement is politics itself. But Zionist negation was, first of all, a denial that there was a Jewish politics in the exile, or even a collective Jewish history. Here's Ben-Gurion. Since our last national tragedy, that he's referring to the suppression of the Bar Kokhba rebellion in the year 135 of the Common Era, since our last national tragedy, we have had histories of persecution, of legal discrimination, of the Inquisition and pogroms, of martyrdom. But we have not had a Jewish history, because the history of a people is only what the people create as a whole. And the Jews, according to Ben-Gurion, created nothing in the centuries of exile. In fact, the internal politics of the Jewish diaspora, through which the people as a whole sustained itself in scattered communities without coercive power for many centuries, is one of the more remarkable stories in the political history of humankind. Exilic politics was in its decadence when the Zionists arrived on the scene, and it had never been valued within the tradition itself. Committed to deference and deferment, dreaming of a distant triumph, the rabbis had little to say about the success of the semi-autonomous communities of the diaspora, and they took no interest in the political lessons that might be drawn from it. This could have provided an opening for Zionist writers, but they found the decadence of Jewish communal life a more useful subject and made no effort to overcome their ignorance of its better days. For some of them, indeed, ignorance of exilic history, since it wasn't a real national history, was a matter of principle. Achad Ha'am at least acknowledged the better days. The rabbinic sages, he wrote, succeeded in creating a national body which hung in midair without any foundation on solid earth. And in this body, the Hebrew national spirit has had its abode and lived its life for 2,000 years. But the real achievement of exilic Jewry, marvelous and unique, as Achad Ha'am said, was to lose the singularity of this body and still survive in scattered fragments, all living one form of life and all united despite their local separateness. These fine words were apparently not inspirational. I have not found in the literature of Zionism any discovery of the old Jewish communities. I mean, any extended effort to understand how exilic politics worked, or to honor the people who made it work, or to value the achievement. The laws, customs, practices, and implicit understandings that made the communal life of the exile possible, surely this is material for ingathering, and then for appreciation and critique by a movement aiming at a new birth of communal life. Indeed, the experience of exile, and then of emancipation in exile, might well teach contemporary Israelis something of great importance. How different Jewish communities could coexist within the framework of a secular state alongside other non-Jewish religious communities. The new Israeli majority might learn a lot from the experience of the old Jewish minorities. Another obvious place for engagement, as in India and Algeria, is with the traditional subordination of women, which took different forms in Judaism than it did in Hinduism and in Islam, never reaching, for example, to the radical seclusion of the purdah, but still mandating the exclusion of women from public religious and political life. The liberationist commitment to create a new man was also a commitment to create a new woman, set free from her traditionally required submission to patriarchal authority. The actual standing of women in the kibbutz movement, in the Haganah, and then in the Israeli army didn't and doesn't always accord with liberationist ideology, but the ideological position is clear. In the new nation state, there would be gender equality. I've already described how religious revival challenges the very idea of equality, and how surprised and unprepared the liberationists were for the willingness of many women to return to orthodoxy and accept a version of the old subordination. They are almost equally surprised by the fierceness of the religious zealots' attack on gender equality, even in the Israeli army, which has been one of the prime instruments of liberationist transformation and something of a sacred cow, to mix my cases, in Israeli politics. The egalitarian argument seems obvious to me, but it's also obvious that simply reciting the argument isn't sufficient. Today, there are religious women in every denomination of Judaism arguing for equality in the language of the tradition and producing wonderfully subtle and intellectually engaging reinterpretations of both the Bible and the Talmud. It may be a sign of the polarization produced by secularists and zealots in Israel that a great deal of the early feminist interpretive work was not done there, but in the diaspora. Indeed, much of the religious energy among American Jews today comes from women who make up a growing number of ordained rabbis. Needless to say, nothing similar is going on in Israel, where secular Jewish women aren't interested in becoming rabbis, and religious women wouldn't dream of it, though some, I think, are beginning to dream. Perhaps there is a pattern here. The central office of women living under Muslim laws is not in Algeria or in any Muslim-majority country, but it is in London. And Amartya Sen, Akhil Bilgrami, and Uma Narayan, eloquent critics of Archimedean secularism in India, live in the United States. The men and women who reclaim tradition while also criticizing it bear some resemblance to the early leaders of national liberation who also lived for long periods of time outside the countries they meant to liberate. But arguments for a critical engagement with the tradition will make their way home. At least they have some chance of appealing to men and women who tire of the radical polarity of negation and revival. In all three of my cases, we can begin to see writers and activists struggling to occupy the space between the poles. In Israel, and I suspect in India and Algeria too, the clearest examples come from the academic world. The project of critical engagement has not yet found what is most necessary to its success, a strong political expression. I haven't meant to argue in these lectures that the traditionalist counter-revolution could have been avoided, the paradox of national liberation overcome, had the Zionists, say, fully engaged the tradition from the beginning. But a full-scale engagement early on might have made for a stronger response to the counter-revolution than anything forthcoming today. It might have provided Zionism with a more elaborated, a more interesting, and a more democratic culture. And it might have improved the odds, it might still improve the odds for the eventual success of Jewish national liberation. This suggests a view that has become more and more appealing to me as I have worked on these three cases. National liberation, like every other form of liberation, is a very long process, not a single battle, but a series of battles that extends over many decades. Despite the engagement of religious zealots, this process is secular in two senses of the word, as the dictionary defines the word. Liberation is a worldly process, and it is of indefinite duration. It's secular in another sense, too. Its outcome is not determined by faith, not by religious faith, and not by the ideological version either. The early liberationists believed that their struggle had a singular and certain end. But the critical engagement with religious beliefs and practices is liberating in a new way. Now the end is open, radically uncertain. Or better, the process is unendingly various. The task of men and women committed to national liberation is to sustain their engagement with the traditions of their nation and at the same time their fierce opposition to all the versions of traditionalist passivity and oppression. Now, I've always disliked lecturers and writers who end by telling other people what their task is. But since the task that I've just described has also been my own task in these lectures, I don't mind recommending it to any of you who share my conviction that many nations, including these three, still need to be liberated. Thank you.